The morning of December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day, inside a freezing stone cellar in Hemroulle, Belgium, just northwest of Bastogne, Lieutenant Colonel John Cooper watched his Fire Direction Center calculate coordinates for what would become the most concentrated artillery barrage his battalion had ever delivered. Outside, 18 German Mark IV tanks, their hulls painted in winter camouflage, advanced through the pre-dawn darkness, supported by waves of white-clad infantry from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division. The attack had begun at 3 in the morning. Now, 45 minutes later, Cooper's 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion stood as the only barrier between those tanks and the complete collapse of Bastogne's northwestern perimeter. Cooper's battalion operated 12 150mm M2A1 howitzers, 12 guns against 18 tanks and several hundred infantry. The mathematics seemed impossible. But Cooper understood something the attacking Germans did not, something that would transform those 12 howitzers into the most lethal defensive weapon system on the battlefield. His guns could fire 10 rounds per minute at maximum rate. His crews were trained, supplied, and positioned. And most importantly, his Fire Direction Center could coordinate all 12 weapons to deliver simultaneous fire with a precision German artillery could not match. The thunder that followed would teach German tank commanders a lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. American 105mm howitzers were not merely artillery pieces. They were instruments of mathematical destruction, capable of delivering concentrated firepower with a speed and accuracy that violated every assumption German doctrine had made about defensive artillery operations. By the time the sun rose on Christmas morning, not one of those 18 German tanks would reach American lines. And the story of how 12 howitzers stopped a reinforced armored assault would become one of the most remarkable artillery actions of the Second World War. But to understand what happened at Hemroulle on Christmas Day 1944, we must first understand what made the American 105mm howitzer system so fundamentally different from anything the German army had encountered before. The weapon itself was unremarkable. The 105mm howitzer M2A1 weighed just under 5,000 pounds. Its tube measured 22 calibers in length, shorter than comparable German artillery. Maximum range with standard high-explosive ammunition reached 12,330 yards, approximately 7 miles. Nothing about these specifications suggested superiority. German 105mm howitzers matched or exceeded these performance characteristics. The Elite FH-18, Germany's standard divisional artillery piece, fired a similar projectile to comparable ranges with equivalent accuracy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But specifications told only part of the story. The critical difference lay not in the gun's barrel or carriage, but in how American artillery battalions employed their weapons as an integrated system. Each American field artillery battalion in Europe operated 12 105mm howitzers, organized into 3 batteries of 4 guns each. These 12 weapons did not function as individual artillery pieces. They functioned as a single weapon system with 12 barrels, all controlled from a central fire direction center that could calculate firing data and coordinate simultaneous impact with unprecedented speed. The Fire Direction Center was the invisible innovation that transformed American artillery from a collection of individual guns into a precision instrument of massed firepower. Developed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma during the interwar period, the Fire Direction Center concept centralized all firing calculations at the battalion level. When a forward observer called for fire, his request went directly to the Battalion Fire Direction Center, not to individual battery commanders. Fire direction officers computed firing data for all guns simultaneously using graphical firing tables, devices that reduced calculation time from 3 to 5 minutes per battery down to under 30 seconds for the entire battalion. This calculation speed enabled something revolutionary: time-on-target missions. In a time-on-target strike, Guns at different distances from the target fired at different times, with firing sequences precisely calculated so that all shells arrived over the target within a 3-second window, instead of rounds arriving sequentially over several minutes, giving defenders time to take cover after the first explosions. Every shell impacted simultaneously. The entire barrage occurred in an instant, before anyone could react. German artillery could not execute time-on-target missions against targets of opportunity. German fire direction remained decentralized at the battery level. Each battery commander computed his own firing data using tabular firing tables, a time-consuming process that required skilled officers and took several minutes, even under ideal conditions. Coordinating multiple batteries for simultaneous fire required extensive pre-planning and was practical only for prepared attacks, not for defensive engagements, where targets appeared without warning. At Bastogne, the defenders needed artillery that could respond to sudden German attacks with devastating speed. The encircled garrison possessed limited ammunition, limited manpower, and faced German forces that outnumbered them approximately 5-1. Artillery would have to substitute for the infantry reserves and armored counterattack forces the defenders lacked. Every German assault would have to be broken by concentrated artillery fire before it could reach American positions. And that required a level of responsiveness German doctrine considered impossible. The German offensive had begun 9 days earlier, on December 16, 1944, when 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks smashed through thinly held American positions in the Ardennes. The surprise was nearly complete. Poor weather had grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft. German radio discipline had been excellent. American intelligence had detected no indication of the massive buildup occurring in the Eifel forests east of the Ardennes. The initial German artillery barrage employed 1,600 guns, firing simultaneously across an 80-mile front. 90 minutes of concentrated bombardment shattered communications, destroyed command posts, and left American units isolated and confused. German armor and infantry poured through the gaps, driving west toward the Meuse River and the ultimate objective of Antwerp, the critical Allied supply port. But the German offensive required speed. Hitler's planners had calculated that German forces must reach the Meuse within 4 days and Antwerp within a week. These timelines were not arbitrary. The Germans had limited fuel supplies. Weather forecasts indicated clearing conditions after December 23rd, which would bring Allied air superiority back into play. The entire plan depended on rapid penetration before American reinforcements could arrive and before Allied fighter bombers could interdict German supply columns. Bastogne threatened that timetable. The small Belgian town set at the convergence of 7 major roads in the Ardennes highlands. German armored columns advancing west needed those roads. Winter conditions and narrow forest tracks made off-road movement practically impossible for mechanized forces. Bastogne controlled the road network. If American forces held Bastogne, German armor would be forced onto secondary roads through difficult terrain, slowing the advance and consuming precious fuel. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, recognized immediately that Bastogne must be captured. On December 18th, he ordered the Panzergrenadier Division to seize the town as quickly as possible. But American reinforcements were already arriving. The 101st Airborne Division, pulled from rest areas near Reims, France, traveled over 100 miles through the night of December 18th and reached Bastogne on the morning of December 19th, just hours before German forces closed the encirclement. The Airborne Division brought limited heavy weapons. Paratroopers typically fought with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. They lacked the tanks, tank destroyers, and heavy artillery that mechanized divisions possessed. But Bastogne's defenders included critical attachments that transformed the garrison's capabilities. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division provided approximately 40 medium and light tanks, 3 artillery. Battalions commandeered and organized into a temporary artillery group brought 36 and 55mm Howitzers to supplement the airborne division's organic artillery, and crucially, 4 battalions of 105mm Howitzers supported the 101st Airborne. The division's own artillery included the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion, the 907th Glider Field Artillery Battalion, and the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. A 4th battalion, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, had been temporarily attached to the 101st and arrived at Bastogne still loaded on trucks, having driven through the night from Mourmelon. These 4 battalions operated a total of 48 105mm Howitzers, 48 guns, to defend a perimeter approximately 16 miles in circumference against German forces that included 2 panzer divisions, the Panzergrenadier Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The artillery would become the decisive defensive weapon, but only if ammunition supplies held out, and only if fire direction centers could coordinate fires rapidly enough to catch German attacks before they reached American lines. The encirclement closed on December 20th. German forces cut the last road into Bastogne, isolating approximately 15,000 American troops. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, now serving as acting division commander in the absence of Major General Maxwell Taylor, organized the defense into regimental task forces. Each task force combined infantry, engineers, tanks, tank destroyers, and proportional shares of artillery into combined arms teams capable of defending assigned sectors. The artillery battalions positioned themselves inside the perimeter, close to the town center. This placement seemed counterintuitive. Doctrine normally called for artillery to position well behind the front lines, but Bastogne's perimeter was so small that artillery placed anywhere inside the defensive ring could range any point on the perimeter within seconds. The central position also allowed batteries to fire in any direction, providing 360-degree coverage essential for a surrounded garrison. Lieutenant Colonel Cooper's 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion occupied positions near Hemroulle, northwest of Bastogne. Cooper, a West Point graduate and experienced artillery officer, had positioned his battalion to support the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, which defended the western and southwestern sectors of the perimeter. The 463rd had arrived at Bastogne with trucks still loaded with ammunition, a fortunate circumstance since the battalion carried far more rounds than airborne artillery typically transported. The defenders immediately faced supply challenges. The food was rationed. Medical supplies ran short after a German night raid captured most of the division's medical company on December 19th. And, critically, artillery ammunition stocks declined rapidly as battalions fired defensive missions throughout December 20th and 21st. By December 22nd, ammunition had become so scarce that McAuliffe ordered artillery restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day for non-emergency missions. 10 rounds per gun per day meant that each 105mm howitzer could fire only 10 shells under normal circumstances. For a battalion of 12 guns, that allowed 120 rounds total per day. The restriction was painful, but necessary. Ammunition stocks were finite. Resupply by road was impossible with German forces surrounding the town. Air resupply depended on weather that had remained overcast and foggy since the offensive began. Until the weather cleared, Bastogne's artillery would have to husband every round. The ammunition restriction forced fire direction centers to prioritize ruthlessly. Forward observers called for fire constantly as they detected German movements, assembly areas, and attack preparations. But fire direction officers had to evaluate each request and determine whether the target justified expending precious rounds. Artillery would be saved for emergency defensive missions when German attacks directly threatened American positions. Harassing fire, counter-battery missions, and interdiction of rear areas would have to wait until ammunition supplies improved. On December the 22nd, German forces delivered a surrender ultimatum. A delegation under flag of truce approached American lines carrying a typewritten message demanding that Bastogne's garrison surrender within 2 hours or face annihilation. The message warned that 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions and 1 German artillery corps stood ready to destroy the town, and that civilian casualties resulting from the bombardment would be the Americans' responsibility. McAuliffe's response became legendary. When staff officers brought him the German ultimatum, McAuliffe read it and replied, "Nuts." His staff reminded him that the Germans were awaiting a formal response. McAuliffe wrote a brief reply to the German commander, "Nuts, the American commander." The German officers who received this response were confused by the colloquial American expression. An American officer translated it more directly, "Go to hell." The defiant reply accurately reflected the garrison's confidence. Despite desperate circumstances, McAuliffe understood that German forces had bypassed Bastogne rather than concentrating overwhelming strength for a single massive assault. German armored divisions had continued west, leaving only the 26th Volksgrenadier Division to capture the town. The Germans were probing different points of the perimeter in sequence rather than attacking simultaneously. This sequential approach allowed American defenders to shift artillery and mobile reserves to meet each assault, taking advantage of interior lines to concentrate superior force at each point of contact. But confidence required ammunition. And on December 23rd, the weather finally cleared. That morning, Allied supply aircraft began dropping desperately needed supplies by parachute. 241 cargo planes delivered ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and gasoline in the first resupply drop. American soldiers rushed to retrieve the supply bundles using parachute silk for bandages and cheering as crates of artillery ammunition landed safely inside the perimeter. The resupply transformed the tactical situation. Artillery battalions no longer faced the 10-round restriction. Fire direction centers could now approve missions that had been denied during the ammunition shortage. Forward observers who had watched German formations move unmolested could now call for fire with confidence that shells would actually be delivered. The clearing weather also brought American fighter bombers to the battlefield. P-47 Thunderbolts began attacking German positions, vehicles and supply columns, working in coordination with artillery forward observers who directed both air and artillery strikes against identified targets. German commanders recognized that the weather change gave the Americans decisive advantages. Field Marshal Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, ordered one final assault on Bastogne before American relief columns could break through from the south. The attack would come on December the 25th, Christmas Day, a reinforced assault intended to overwhelm the defenders before Patton's Third Army could reach the town. The German plan called for attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent American defenders from concentrating forces. But German coordination failed. Units attacked sequentially rather than simultaneously, repeating the tactical error that had characterized German operations at Bastogne throughout the siege. The most dangerous thrust came from the northwest, directly toward Hemroulle and Lieutenant Colonel Cooper's 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. At 3:30 in the morning on December the 25th, Sergeant Joseph Rogan of the 463rd sat in a foxhole on the outskirts of Hemroulle, staring into darkness and fog. Rogan served as a forward observer, positioned with his partner, Corporal Restor Bryan, in front of the main American defensive line. Their job was to detect German movements and call fire missions when enemy forces approached. The morning was bitterly cold. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering the frozen ground and making visibility even worse in the pre-dawn darkness. Rogan could hear occasional sounds from the German lines several hundred yards away, but he could see nothing. He and Bryan waited, listening, watching for any indication of enemy activity. At approximately 3:30, the attack began. 18 Mark IV tanks with supporting infantry broke through the thin defensive line of the 327th Glider Infantry and began advancing toward Hemroulle. The breakthrough occurred in darkness, exploiting poor visibility and the thinly manned defensive positions that characterized Bastogne's overstretched perimeter. German planners had identified the northwestern sector as vulnerable. If tanks could penetrate to Hemroulle and destroy the American artillery positioned there, the entire western flank of the defensive perimeter would collapse. The German column advanced several miles before meeting significant resistance. 11 of the tanks, with accompanying infantry, proceeded to the outskirts of Hemroulle, evidently mistaking the town for Bastogne itself, and pulled off the road to halt. Their stopping point placed them approximately 100 yards from several of the 463rd's Howitzers, which remained invisible in the darkness combined with the recent snowfall. The German column remained in position for over an hour. Tank crews dismounted. Infantry gathered near the vehicles. German soldiers appeared to be preparing breakfast, confident they had reached their objective and secured a position from which to launch the final assault into what they believed was Bastogne proper. Cooper received reports of the German tanks shortly after they halted. His fire direction center tracked their position carefully. Forward observers reported seeing dismounted tank crews and large numbers of infantry concentrated near the vehicles. But Cooper faced a critical decision. American armor was known to be approaching Bastogne from the south as Patton's relief column fought toward the town. Firing on unidentified vehicles in darkness risked hitting friendly forces. Cooper ordered his men to wait until positive identification could be made. As dawn approached, visibility improved slightly. Observers began to see details of the halted column. The distinctive muzzle brakes on the tank's main guns became visible. The German crosses painted on the turret sides could be distinguished. These were enemy vehicles, and they had stopped in a position where every gun in Cooper's battalion could engage them simultaneously. Cooper made his decision. His 12 howitzers would fire in direct fire mode, aiming at visible targets rather than using indirect fire with calculated trajectories. Direct fire against armor was dangerous for artillery crews, exposing them to potential counterfire, but the range was short, less than 200 yards for some guns, and the targets were concentrated, motionless, with dismounted crews vulnerable in the open. The Fire Direction Center calculated firing data rapidly. All 12 howitzers would engage. High explosive rounds would be used, not armor-piercing shells which the howitzers did not carry. But high explosive rounds could disable tanks through near misses that damaged tracks, optics, and external equipment. Direct hits could penetrate thinner armor on top surfaces and engine decks, and infantry caught in the open would be devastated by airburst and groundburst explosions. When the command to fire was given, all 12 howitzers opened fire nearly simultaneously. The first rounds impacted among the German vehicles within seconds. Tank crews scrambled for their vehicles. Infantry scattered, seeking cover that did not exist in the flat, snow-covered fields. More rounds followed. The 463rd could sustain 10 rounds per gun per minute at maximum rate. That meant 120 rounds per minute from the battalion. 2 rounds per second every second for as long as ammunition held out. The effect was catastrophic for the German column. Tanks that attempted to move found their tracks damaged by near misses. Crews that attempted to return fire discovered that howitzer positions were difficult to locate through smoke and muzzle flash. Infantry could not approach the American guns through the curtain of high explosive fire. Within minutes, multiple tanks were burning. Others sat immobilized, tracks blown off or engines damaged. The battle lasted approximately 30 minutes of concentrated fire. 8 tanks were knocked out, and 1 was captured intact. The remaining German tanks withdrew, leaving their infantry support stranded. American infantry from the 327th Glider Infantry advanced to mop up survivors. The captured tank, a Mark IV, was driven into American lines and used as a roadblock. The action demonstrated artillery capabilities that German officers had never witnessed before. 12 howitzers had destroyed or disabled half of an 18-tank assault force in direct combat. The guns had fired with devastating accuracy at short range, coordinating their fire to achieve maximum effect against moving and stationary targets, and the rate of fire had overwhelmed German attempts to respond. But what stunned German commanders who investigated the failed attack was not simply that artillery had engaged tanks successfully. Artillery had engaged tanks throughout the war, sometimes with good results. What stunned them was the speed and coordination. American fire direction had calculated and executed the engagement in minutes. All 12 guns had fired as a coordinated battery, despite being dispersed across several hundred yards of terrain. The volume of fire sustained throughout the engagement suggested ammunition supplies far beyond what German intelligence had estimated the encircled garrison possessed. The Christmas Day assault on Hemroulle represented the last serious German attempt to overrun Bastogne from the northwest. Later that morning, elements of Patton's 4th Armoured Division broke through German lines south of the town, opening a corridor that ended the siege. But the perimeter had held, and artillery had been the decisive defensive weapon, breaking German attacks repeatedly throughout the 8 days of encirclement. During the period from December 19th to December 31st, 1944, the 463rd fired over a 360-degree sector, expending a total of 7,676 rounds of ammunition on almost every kind of ground target. That represented approximately 640 rounds per howitzer over 12 days of combat. By comparison, by December 22nd, artillery ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per gun per day for non-emergency missions across the garrison. The 463rd's expenditure was high because the battalion fought continuously, engaging targets of opportunity throughout the encirclement. Other artillery battalions at Bastogne showed similar patterns of intensive fire. On December the 20th alone, no less than 7 battalions fired 2,600 rounds solely at enemy armor. This represented coordinated fire from multiple artillery battalions, simultaneously engaging German tank formations that threatened different sectors of the perimeter. The volume of fire American artillery sustained at Bastogne shocked German commanders who understood the logistical challenges of maintaining ammunition supply to an encircled garrison. German artillery in comparable situations would have been restricted to minimal fire to conserve limited stocks. But American artillery fired continuously, suggesting either massive pre-positioned ammunition reserves or effective air resupply under conditions German planners considered impossible. The truth combined both factors. Artillery battalions that reached Bastogne before the encirclement closed had brought substantial ammunition loads. Cooper's 463rd had made the fortunate decision to load every available truck with ammunition when departing Mourmelon, giving the battalion reserves that other units lacked. And air resupply, beginning December the 23rd, delivered thousands of additional rounds, although precise accounting of ammunition delivered by parachute remains incomplete. But ammunition alone did not explain American artillery effectiveness. German artillery possessed adequate ammunition for defensive operations, at least in the early stages of the Ardennes offensive. What German artillery lacked was the fire direction system that allowed rapid calculation and coordination of massed fires. German batteries remained tied to tabular firing methods that required several minutes per battery to compute firing data. Coordinating multiple batteries for simultaneous fire was practical only with extensive preparation. American fire direction centers could calculate data for entire battalions in under 30 seconds using graphical firing tables. This speed enabled responsive fire against targets of opportunity, the precise situation Bastogne presented throughout the siege. German attacks came without predictable timing. Targets appeared suddenly as German forces moved into assembly areas or advanced toward American lines. Artillery had to respond within minutes or the opportunity would pass. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. German infantry attacking Bastogne's perimeter faced a defensive system where every movement drew immediate artillery response. Assembly areas that should have been safe from observation were targeted within minutes of troops gathering. Approach routes the German planners had identified as concealed were interdicted by accurate fire. Tank formations attempting to mass for assaults found themselves under fire before they could deploy. German tactical doctrine assumed that artillery preparation preceded attacks and that defending artillery would respond gradually, allowing attackers time to close with defenders. At Bastogne, those assumptions failed. American artillery fired first, accurately and devastatingly. German attacks were broken by concentrated fire before they reached American infantry positions. One German regimental commander who participated in the assaults on Bastogne later wrote that his troops lost confidence in their ability to attack successfully. They had been told that surprise and superior numbers would overwhelm the Americans. Instead, they found themselves advancing into kill zones where every movement drew instant artillery response. Units took casualties before making contact with American infantry. Soldiers who had fought across Europe without questioning German superiority began to question whether the war was winnable. This erosion of confidence was as significant as the physical casualties. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, assigned to capture Bastogne, suffered heavy losses throughout the siege and made no significant progress against the American perimeter. The Panzergrenadier Division, redirected from other objectives to assist in capturing the town, likewise failed to achieve breakthrough. German commanders were forced to acknowledge that Bastogne could not be taken without concentrating overwhelming force, and such concentration was impossible given the demands of the broader offensive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The failure at Bastogne had strategic consequences beyond the immediate tactical situation. The town controlled the road network the Germans needed for their advance west. With Bastogne in American hands, German armored columns were forced onto secondary roads through difficult terrain. This slowed the offensive, consumed precious fuel, and allowed American reinforcements time to arrive. By December the 26th, when Patton's relief column broke through to Bastogne, the German offensive had already failed strategically. The furthest German advance reached the village of Foy-Notre-Dame, approximately 60 miles from the starting positions, but still 40 miles short of the Meuse River. Improved weather from December 24th onward brought Allied air power into the battle. Fighter bombers attacked German supply columns, destroying trucks and creating traffic jams that paralyzed German logistics. The combination of American artillery superiority and Allied air superiority proved decisive. German forces could not mass for coordinated attacks during daylight without being devastated by airstrikes. They could not move supplies forward without fighter bombers interdicting convoys. And they could not attack American positions at night without encountering artillery fire that arrived with terrifying speed and accuracy. The M101A1 howitzer that equipped American artillery battalions at Bastogne was not a wonder weapon. Its range of 7 miles was modest. Its high explosive shell weighed 33 pounds, less than German 155mm shells. The weapon required a crew of 8 to operate, more manpower than some German equivalents. But these specifications missed the point. The howitzer was merely one component of a system. That system included the Fire Direction Center, with its graphical firing tables, enabling rapid calculation. It included forward observers, embedded with infantry units, at company level, equipped with powerful radios, maintaining constant communication with battalion fire direction centers. It included standardized procedures that allowed any observer to call fire from any battery in range, not just batteries organic to their own unit. It included pre-surveyed positions, ensuring guns knew their exact locations, eliminating a major source of aiming error. It included regular meteorological updates, accounting for wind, temperature, and air density effects on shell trajectories. Every element worked together. Remove any single component and the system degraded. But with all elements functioning, the system delivered precision-coordinated firepower that no other army could match. German soldiers facing that system learned to fear the distinctive sound of American artillery more than any other weapon on the battlefield. The tactical decision to employ howitzers in direct fire roles represented another innovation: American artillery battalions at Bastogne, implemented out of necessity. On December the 21st, the 463rd Battalion commenced redeployment of howitzers into previously prepared direct fire positions from which they could defend against tanks, done because of the changing tactical situation and also because supplies of high explosive ammunition had dwindled to the point where they were insufficient to support heavy indirect fire missions. Direct fire meant aiming artillery pieces, like rifles, at visible targets rather than using calculated trajectories for indirect fire. The practice was dangerous for gun crews, but effective at short ranges. Artillery positioned in direct fire roles could engage tanks, infantry, and fortified positions with devastating accuracy. The large, high-explosive shells that howitzers fired created massive blast effects, even without penetrating armor. Near misses disabled tanks by destroying tracks, optics, and external equipment. Direct hits on top armor or engine compartments could destroy tanks outright. 2 howitzers from Battery C redeployed about 700 yards northwest of Hemroulle, astride the road to Champs, into direct fire positions from which to defend against tanks. These guns functioned as anti-tank weapons despite firing ammunition not specifically designed for armor penetration. The positioning placed them directly in the path of any German attack from the northwest, the exact direction from which the Christmas morning assault would come. Other artillery battalions at Bastogne adopted similar tactics. The shortage of dedicated anti-tank weapons made artillery essential for stopping German armor. Tank destroyers were present in limited numbers, and American tanks were outnumbered by German panzers. Artillery had to substitute for missing anti-tank assets, and American gun crews proved capable of engaging armor successfully when required. The engagement at Hemroulle on Christmas morning demonstrated that properly positioned artillery, manned by trained crews and supported by effective fire direction, could defeat armored attacks even without specialized anti-tank ammunition. The key factors were positioning that allowed direct fire at short range, fire direction that could coordinate multiple guns simultaneously, and crews disciplined enough to hold fire until positive target identification was achieved. German tank tactics at Bastogne showed fundamental misunderstanding of American artillery capabilities. German commanders repeatedly massed armor for attacks without adequate reconnaissance of American artillery positions. They assumed that encircled American forces would have limited ammunition and degraded fire control capabilities. They expected American artillery to respond slowly, giving attacking forces time to close with infantry positions before concentrated fires could be brought to bear. Every assumption proved wrong. American artillery had adequate ammunition after the December 23rd resupply drop. Fire control remained effective throughout the siege despite communications challenges, and American artillery responded with terrifying speed, catching German forces in assembly areas and destroying attacks before they reached American infantry lines. The pattern repeated throughout the siege. German attacks were announced by concentrations of troops and armor in assembly areas. American forward observers detected these concentrations and called fire missions. Fire direction centers calculated and distributed firing data within minutes. Multiple batteries engaged simultaneously, delivering concentrated fire that disrupted German preparations and inflicted heavy casualties before attacks could develop momentum. When German forces did advance, they encountered defensive artillery fire that arrived continuously as long as targets remained visible. The sustained rate of fire American artillery battalions achieved shocked German veterans accustomed to Soviet artillery that fired massive but brief barrages, or German artillery that fired careful but slow missions. American artillery fired rapidly, accurately, and continuously, adjusting fire in real time based on observer reports. The combination of rapid response, sustained fire, and flexible coordination created a defensive firepower system German attacks could not overcome. German tactical doctrine assumed that infantry and armor attacking together could break through defensive lines if they accepted casualties and maintained momentum. At Bastogne, that doctrine failed because artillery broke attacks before they reached the infantry perimeter. German units took casualties from artillery fire while still in approach march formation, before deploying for assault at distances where German infantry weapons could not engage American defenders. The psychological effect on German troops was cumulative. Initial attacks met unexpected artillery resistance. Subsequent attacks met even heavier fire as American gun crews gained experience and fire direction centers refined procedures. By the final days of the siege, German soldiers attacking Bastogne understood they would face devastating artillery fire throughout their advance. This knowledge degraded combat effectiveness. Troops who expected to be shelled attacked cautiously, slowly, with reduced aggressiveness. Units that took casualties from artillery often broke or withdrew before reaching their objectives. The contrast with German expectations was stark. German soldiers in 1944 had fought across Europe against enemies who possessed artillery but lacked the coordination, speed, and sustained firepower American artillery delivered. Soviet artillery was powerful but inflexible. British artillery was well organized but emphasized deliberate fire planning over rapid response. American artillery combined speed, flexibility, and overwhelming firepower in ways German troops had never encountered. After the war, German commanders analyzing the Ardennes offensive consistently identified American artillery as one of the decisive factors in their defeat. Field Marshal von Manteuffel noted that American artillery coordination was far superior to German capabilities, and that Allied control of the air, combined with highly effective artillery, made German counterattacks extremely costly and usually unsuccessful. The observation was significant, coming from an experienced commander who understood artillery employment at the operational level. The success of American artillery at Bastogne was not accidental or improvised. It resulted from systematic institutional development over 2 decades. Officers at Fort Sill had studied World War I artillery operations, identified deficiencies, developed solutions, tested procedures, and trained thousands of artillery officers in the new doctrine. The graphical firing table that enabled rapid firing data calculation was invented in November 1940 by Captain Abbott Harrington Burns, working overnight to solve what he called the slow torture of intricate mathematics. The fire direction center concept, that centralized control at battalion level, was developed by Major Orlando Ward, who served as director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill from 1932 through 1934. Ward created a system where battalion fire direction centers controlled all guns simultaneously, rather than having each battery commander compute firing data independently. This centralization enabled true massing of fires with multiple batteries engaging the same target with minimal delay. By the time the United States entered World War II, battalion-level fire direction centers were doctrine throughout the field artillery branch. Every artillery officer was trained in fire direction procedures. Every battalion possessed the equipment, communications, and technical data required to execute the system. The doctrine had been refined through years of peacetime training and exercises. When American artillery went to combat in North Africa in 1942, the system worked because it had been carefully prepared during peace. At Bastogne, that system faced its most demanding test, an encircled garrison with limited ammunition, degraded communications, and constant pressure from a numerically superior enemy. Artillery had to respond to attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Forward observers were stretched thin, covering a 16-mile perimeter with limited personnel. Fire direction centers had to prioritize missions ruthlessly when ammunition was restricted. Gun crews had to operate in extreme cold with inadequate shelter and constant threat of enemy fire. The system performed brilliantly. Artillery broke every major German attack. Forward observers maintained communication with fire direction centers throughout the siege, despite telephone lines being cut repeatedly. Fire direction centers calculated missions rapidly enough to engage targets before they could disperse. Gun crews sustained high rates of fire even when operating howitzers in direct fire roles against visible enemy armor. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing from December 19, 1944 to January 6, 1945. These casualties occurred while defending against German forces that outnumbered the garrison 5-1 and included multiple panzer and infantry divisions. The casualty rate would have been far higher without artillery that stopped German attacks before they reached American infantry positions. The German 26th Volksgrenadier Division, assigned primary responsibility for capturing Bastogne, was bled white during the siege and achieved no significant penetration of American defenses. The Panzer Division one of Germany's best-equipped armored formations, likewise failed to break American lines despite repeated attempts. German commanders were forced to acknowledge that Bastogne could not be taken without concentrating overwhelming force, and such concentration was impossible given the demands of the broader offensive. The failure at Bastogne had strategic consequences. German armored columns were forced onto secondary roads that slowed their advance and consumed precious fuel. The delay allowed American reinforcements time to arrive and organize defensive positions further west. By the time Patton's relief column broke through on December 26th, the German offensive had already failed strategically, even though heavy fighting would continue for another month. The 105mm howitzer that equipped American artillery battalions at Bastogne was never marketed as a revolutionary weapon. It was simply a well-designed, reliable artillery piece, served by trained crews and integrated into a fire direction system that enabled unprecedented coordination and responsiveness. The weapon's maximum range of 7 miles was adequate for divisional artillery supporting infantry operations. Its high explosive shell provided good fragmentation effects against personnel and light structures. The carriage was mobile enough to be towed by standard 2.5-ton trucks, but the system that employed those howitzers was revolutionary. Fire direction centers that could calculate missions in seconds rather than minutes. Forward observers embedded with infantry at company level, maintaining constant communication with battalion fire direction. Time-on-target techniques that delivered simultaneous fire from multiple batteries. Flexible fire support coordination that allowed any observer to request fire from any battery in range. Pre-surveyed positions, current meteorological data, standardized ammunition and graphical firing tables that simplified complex ballistic calculations. Every element worked together to create a system where artillery functioned as a single weapon with dozens or hundreds of barrels, all controlled through coordinated fire direction centers capable of massing devastating fire anywhere within range, within minutes of a target being identified. German soldiers facing that system learned there was no safe area within American artillery range. Movement drew fire, concentrations drew fire, assembly areas drew fire. The presence of American observation aircraft meant that any German activity could be detected and engaged rapidly. The fear German troops developed for American artillery was not irrational. It was based on repeated experiences where American artillery fire arrived faster, more accurately, and with greater intensity than German. Doctrine considered possible. German tactical procedures that had worked against Soviet and British artillery failed against American artillery. Taking cover after first rounds landed was ineffective when all rounds landed simultaneously in time-on-target strikes. Dispersing to avoid concentrated fire was difficult when fire could be shifted rapidly to engage dispersed formations. Counter-battery fire against American artillery was ineffective when American guns could displace within minutes after firing. German artillery doctrine remained fundamentally sound. German guns were well designed and German crews were well trained. But German fire direction remained decentralized and dependent on slow tabular calculations. German artillery could not mass fires against targets of opportunity the way American artillery could. German batteries operated independently rather than as integrated battalions. The system lacked the speed, flexibility, and coordination that characterized American artillery. The institutional development that created American artillery's superiority occurred during peacetime, when budgets were constrained and the army was small. Officers at Fort Sill developed fire direction, center concepts, graphical firing tables, and time-on-target techniques not through massive research programs, but through careful analysis of World War I operations and systematic problem-solving. They identified that the bottleneck limiting artillery effectiveness was firing data calculation, developed tools that accelerated calculations and built training programs that taught the new procedures to every artillery officer. By 1944, when American artillery battalions fought at Bastogne, the system had been refined through years of combat experience in North Africa, Italy, and France. Procedures had been tested under field conditions. Equipment had been improved based on user feedback. Training emphasized the skills required for rapid fire direction and flexible coordination. The result was artillery that could respond to desperate defensive situations, like Bastogne, with capabilities that seemed impossible to German opponents. The Christmas morning battle at Hemroulle, where Lieutenant Colonel Cooper's 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion destroyed or disabled half of an 18-tank assault force in 30 minutes of direct fire, illustrated perfectly what American artillery could achieve when properly employed. 12 howitzers firing as a coordinated battery directed by a fire direction center that calculated and distributed firing data within seconds, engaging visible targets at short range with sustained high-volume fire. The engagement was not typical of artillery operations generally, which relied primarily on indirect fire at longer ranges. But it demonstrated the flexibility and lethality that trained artillery crews could deliver when required. German tank commanders who survived attacks on Bastogne reported that they had never experienced such rapid, accurate, concentrated artillery fire. The volume of fire sustained throughout engagements suggested unlimited ammunition supplies. The speed of response suggested observation and fire direction capabilities far beyond what German intelligence had estimated. The coordination of multiple batteries firing simultaneously suggested command and control systems German artillery did not possess. All of these German observations were accurate. American artillery at Bastogne did have adequate ammunition after air resupply restored stocks. American observation was excellent, with forward observers at company level and aerial observers in L-4 Cub aircraft when weather permitted. American fire direction was faster than German fire direction by a factor of 10 or more, enabling responsive fire that caught German forces before they could react. And American coordination was centralized at battalion and higher levels, allowing massing of fires that German decentralized battery-level control could not achieve. The story of American artillery at Bastogne is not a story of individual heroism, though artillery crews certainly performed heroically under extreme conditions. It is not a story of technological miracles, though innovations like the graphical firing table and proximity fuse were important. It is a story of systematic institutional development, of doctrine developed carefully in peacetime by officers thinking about future wars, of training programs that drilled procedures until they became automatic, of logistics systems that supplied millions of shells to thousands of guns, operating continuously for months. It is a story of communications, networks that kept artillery coordinated, even under the chaos of combat, of maps and surveys, and meteorological data, and firing tables, all prepared in advance, so that when combat began, the system would work. It is a story of thousands of officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted soldiers who learned their roles and executed them professionally under intense pressure. The German army had excellent artillery equipment and skilled crews, but Germany did not have a system comparable to American fire direction. Center operations. German artillery remained battery-level controlled with limited coordination and no centralized fire direction capable of rapidly massing corps-level fires against targets of opportunity. When German artillery faced an enemy with a true integrated artillery system, backed by the largest industrial economy in the world and supported by air superiority that allowed unrestricted observation, German guns were simply overwhelmed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.